History often celebrates great victories and towering leaders, but just as often it overlooks the moments when individuals stood against impossible odds and refused to give in. To understand the remarkable story of Commodore Joshua Barney, we need to step back into one of the darkest days in America's early history, August 24, 1814. The United States, still a fragile republic not yet 40 years old, was once again locked in a struggle with the most powerful empire on earth, the British. On this sweltering August afternoon, British troops marched steadily toward Washington, D.C. The city was unprepared, its defenses weak, and the American army had already broken in retreat. Panic filled the streets as families gathered what little they could and fled westward. Government officials rushed to burn documents so they would not fall into enemy hands. Even the president, James Madison, had abandoned the capital. The nation's capital, its symbol of self-rule and democracy, was on the verge of falling into British hands without a serious fight. At that moment, the very survival of American democracy seemed uncertain. Many feared that if Washington fell, the young republic might never recover. To the British, this was more than a military campaign. It was a demonstration of power, a way to prove that America's experiment in self-government could be crushed. But in the middle of this chaos, one man made a decision that would echo through the pages of history. Commodore Joshua Barney, a seasoned naval commander, stood with no ships left under his control. His Chesapeake Bay Flotilla, an improvised fleet of small boats and gun barges, had been forced to scuttle its vessels to avoid capture. By all logic, his role in the defense of Washington should have ended there. Yet Barney was not a man to walk away when his country was in peril. Instead, he ordered his sailors to do something extraordinary: abandon their destroyed boats, take up muskets, and prepare to fight the British on land. This was unprecedented. Naval forces transforming into infantry, dragging their heavy cannons overland to face the world's most experienced army. What was meant to be a sea battle had become, through sheer determination, a battle fought on dry ground. This act of adaptation and defiance captures the essence of Joshua Barney. While history often reserves its glory for figures like John Paul Jones or Oliver Hazard Perry, Barney's name is usually confined to footnotes. Yet he was every bit their equal in courage and perhaps more daring in his willingness to defy convention. Where others saw rules, Barney saw obstacles waiting to be broken. Where others retreated, he stood firm. His choice on that day reflected a lifetime of resilience. From his youth in Baltimore, where tragedy pushed him to sea as a child, to his adventures in the Revolutionary War and his later service in the French Navy, Barney had always embodied adaptability. He was a man shaped by hardship, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief that determination could overcome even the most crushing disadvantages. The scene in August 1814 was not just a desperate moment in a war. It was also a test of whether the United States could survive as a nation. And at the center of it, Joshua Barney stepped forward when others stepped back. Though wounded and ultimately captured, his actions at Bladensburg became proof that Americans could resist, that they could stand even when surrounded by defeat. Barney's stand reminds us that history is not only written by the victors of grand battles. Sometimes it is shaped by individuals who refuse to surrender, even when the outcome appears certain. His courage on that day turned what could have been a complete humiliation into a story of resilience, one that still speaks to the American spirit centuries later. Every great figure in history begins somewhere ordinary, and Joshua Barney's story is no different. Before he became a celebrated naval commander, he was simply a boy growing up in colonial Maryland, born on July 6, 1759 in Baltimore. At the time, Baltimore was a bustling port city, filled with the sounds of creaking ships, shouting merchants, and the salt-tinged smell of the Atlantic. Though still under British rule, the colonies were alive with trade, ambition, and the early stirrings of an identity that would soon clash with empire. Joshua was born into a respectable middle-class family. His father, William Barney, worked the soil outside Baltimore, tending crops and raising livestock. He was the kind of man who valued hard work and stability, embodying the steady, practical rhythm of colonial life. His mother, Frances Holland Barney, carried the demanding role of raising Joshua and his siblings within the strict religious values common in Maryland society. Their home was modest, like countless others of the era, but filled with discipline, faith, and a belief in honest labor. For a time, it seemed Joshua's life would follow the predictable path of a farmer's son. He would inherit land, learn the rhythms of planting and harvest, and carry on the quiet but steady tradition of his family. Yet fate has a way of overturning expectations. When Joshua was just 11 years old, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly. For the Barney household, this loss was more than emotional grief, it was a devastating practical blow. In colonial America, survival depended on family structure, and without a father, Francis Barney faced an almost impossible situation. At that time, widowed women had few options. Employment for women was scarce, society pressured them to remarry quickly, and there was no safety net to catch those who fell into poverty. Frances was left with several children to feed and raise, but without the resources to sustain them. She was forced into agonizing choices: attempt to remarry and keep the family intact, struggle to survive through limited work opportunities, or send some of her children away in the hope they might find stability elsewhere. For Joshua, the sea offered that possibility. Baltimore's harbor was a gateway to the wider world, and the merchant marine was always hungry for new recruits. It was a hard, dangerous life, especially for a boy so young, but it provided food, training, and the promise of a future. After much painful deliberation, Francis decided to send Joshua to sea. At only 11 years old, he was placed aboard a merchant vessel bound for Liverpool. One can imagine the scene: a small boy standing on the docks watching sailors prepare for a journey across the Atlantic. The ship was alive with smells of tar and salt, the cries of gulls and the groaning of heavy ropes. To Joshua, it must have been overwhelming, an entire floating world of strange rules, hard work, and constant danger. Yet where many boys would have faltered, he thrived. The merchant marine was no gentle training ground. Discipline was harsh, mistakes could be fatal, and survival depended on absolute obedience. But Joshua adapted with remarkable speed. He learned knots, sail management, and navigation faster than older, stronger recruits. He demonstrated an uncanny sense of the sea itself, its moods, dangers, and opportunities. He could anticipate storms, understand the movement of currents, and think several steps ahead in navigation. Even hardened captains and sailors noticed the boy's unusual ability. What could have been a desperate measure to ease his family's burden instead became the foundation of Joshua's destiny. The hardships of maritime life instilled in him discipline, courage, and the creativity to solve problems under pressure. The sea demanded everything from him, but it also shaped him into someone who could face crises head-on. This moment, an 11-year-old orphan sent to the mercy of the ocean, was the true beginning of Joshua Barney's journey. The Atlantic did not just test him, it revealed him. What started as a family tragedy transformed into the spark that would set him on a path to greatness, preparing him for the wars and challenges that would define his legacy. By the time Joshua Barney was in his mid-teens, he had already seen and endured more than many grown men. The boy who had boarded a merchant ship at age 11 did not simply survive, he excelled. The sea became his classroom, his test, and ultimately his calling. Each voyage deepened his skills, hardened his resolve, and expanded his understanding of the world. It was this relentless progression that transformed him from an apprentice sailor into a respected officer and, eventually, a captain before his 18th birthday. Life aboard merchant vessels was brutal and unforgiving. Young recruits often failed within a voyage or two, broken by storms, disease, backbreaking labor, or the merciless discipline of ship officers. Yet Joshua adapted almost instinctively. He mastered knot tying, rigging, and sail management with astonishing speed. He could reef sails in a storm, calculate positions through celestial navigation, and handle complex cargo operations. More than technical skill, he displayed a rare intuition, a sense for the rhythms of wind, tide, and ship movement that even older sailors admired. Joshua's rapid progress brought opportunities few so young could expect. By the age of 16 he was serving as second mate on the King of Prussia, a position that demanded not only technical skill but also leadership. This role exposed him to the business side of maritime life, how shipping routes were chosen, how cargoes were priced, and how merchants balanced risks against potential profit. For a boy who had once stood alone on Baltimore's docks, this was an extraordinary rise. But Joshua's education was not confined to seamanship or trade. His voyages carried him far beyond the Chesapeake and across the Atlantic. He sailed to Europe, observing the sophistication of naval design and commerce in ports like Liverpool and Marseille. He traveled to the Caribbean, where he learned the unpredictable violence of tropical storms and the complexities of colonial trade. He even witnessed the grim realities of the slave trade along Africa's coast, a cruel system that underpinned much of the Atlantic economy. Each journey broadened his perspective, teaching him that the sea was not only about survival but also about economics, politics, and human ambition. By age 18, Joshua Barney achieved what most sailors only dreamed of: command of his own ship. His vessel, the Maria, was a modest but swift craft suited for coastal trade. Command at such a young age was not just unusual, it was almost unheard of. This was not simply a recognition of his skill as a sailor but also of his ability to lead men, make strategic decisions and manage the complex responsibilities of maritime commerce. He had gone from orphan boy to master of a ship in just 7 years. Yet just as Joshua's career seemed poised for a life of comfortable prosperity, history intervened. The 1760s and 1770s were years of mounting tension between Britain and its colonies. Parliament passed a series of restrictive measures, the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, all aimed at tightening imperial control and extracting revenue from America's trade. These laws directly affected sailors and merchants like Joshua. Trade routes closed, taxes climbed, and British warships began patrolling colonial waters with increasing aggression. Joshua found himself at a crossroads. His personal livelihood depended on Britain's commercial networks, but his identity, his family, and his future were tied to the colonies. Each passing year made the conflict more personal. When British ships began stopping American vessels, impressing sailors into service, and confiscating valuable cargo, neutrality became impossible. By 1775, as the colonies erupted in revolution, Joshua was barely out of his teens but already seasoned by years of hardship, command, and international experience. While many hesitated between loyalty to Britain and sympathy for the patriot cause, Joshua's decision came quickly. He chose revolution. He would fight, not as a merchant seeking profit, but as a naval warrior defending his country's independence. This choice marked the true turning point in his life. The boy who had once gone to sea out of necessity now embraced it as his battlefield. His years of training, intuition, and leadership would be tested not against storms or trade disputes, but against the world's most powerful navy. Joshua Barney's rise from sailor to captain was not just a story of personal advancement, it was the foundation for a career that would challenge empires and carve his name, however faintly, into the chronicles of American history. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, Joshua Barney stood at a crossroads. He was just 18, but already a captain in the merchant trade, commanding his own vessel and earning the respect of seasoned sailors. He could have chosen the safer path, continuing his profitable career, carefully navigating the storm of politics while protecting his livelihood. Yet Joshua was not built for cautious neutrality. His loyalty to the colonies, his instinct for defiance, and his hunger for challenge left him only one real option. He turned his back on commercial safety and offered his skills to the Continental cause. It was no easy choice. The Continental Navy was, by every measure, pitiful compared to the Royal Navy. The British fleet had ruled the seas for centuries, defeating Spain, France, and the Dutch in war after war. Its frigates and ships of the line patrolled the oceans with near-total dominance, commanded by officers hardened in decades of battle. In contrast, the American Navy was a desperate improvisation, converted merchant vessels, small sloops, and hastily built ships manned by volunteers, adventurers, and men with little or no combat experience. To take the sea under the American flag in 1775 was less a profession than a gamble with one's life. Joshua Barney embraced that gamble. His first naval command, the sloop Hornet, was a small, swift craft mounting only 10 guns with a crew of 70 men. On paper she was insignificant. Against any proper British warship, the Hornet would be outgunned and outmatched. Yet in Joshua's hands she became something more than a frail vessel. She became a tool for unconventional warfare. His first great test came in early 1776, patrolling the Delaware coast. There he encountered HMS Roebuck, a 32-gun British frigate commanded by Captain Andrew Snape Hammond. By any conventional calculation, the battle should have been over before it began. The Roebuck carried more than 3 times the firepower of the Hornet, a larger and more experienced crew, and a commander with victories against French and Spanish fleets already under his belt. The logical move for the Americans would have been to run, using shallow waters and local knowledge to escape. But Joshua Barney did not run. He attacked. What followed was a 3-hour duel that revealed the essence of his genius. He refused to fight by British rules. Instead of closing for a traditional exchange of broadsides, he danced around the larger frigate, keeping just within effective range. He darted in, fired rapid broadsides, and slipped back out before the Roebuck could bring its superior guns to bear. He used shallow channels where the British ship risked grounding, forcing Hammond into waters unfamiliar and dangerous for a deep-drafted frigate. Most importantly, Barney's crew aimed not for general destruction but for precision damage. They targeted the Roebuck's rigging, sails, and gun ports, weak points that, if struck, could cripple maneuverability or silence cannons. Instead of wasting fire against the hull, they sought to disrupt, frustrate, and neutralize their enemy. For 3/10 hours the two ships engaged in this deadly dance. Hammond, expecting an easy victory, found himself outwitted at every turn by a young commander who seemed to anticipate his moves. Though the Hornet could not destroy the Roebuck, she refused to be destroyed herself. When shifting winds finally gave the British the advantage, Barney disengaged and slipped into waters too shallow for pursuit. The outcome was technically inconclusive. Neither ship was lost, but its impact was profound. Word spread quickly of the young American who had faced a frigate with a sloop and held his own. To the British, it was a troubling sign that American captains might not follow predictable patterns of naval warfare. To the Americans, it was proof that courage, creativity, and intelligence could level the odds against overwhelming force. Joshua Barney's philosophy emerged clearly from this first great test. When you cannot overpower the enemy, outthink them. Conventional wisdom was not law, it was merely one option among many. This mindset, forged in the crucible of unequal combat, would define his career and influence American naval strategy for decades. The duel with HMS Roebuck placed Barney among the boldest of America's young commanders. Yet it was only the beginning. Ahead lay greater dangers: capture, imprisonment, daring escapes, and battles that would test not only his skill but his endurance and spirit. But in 1776, the lesson had already been set. Joshua Barney was not a man to bow before the might of empire. He was a fighter who believed that even the impossible could be made possible with ingenuity and willpower. For Joshua Barney, courage at sea was never just about winning victories, it was also about surviving the darkest trials. After his early successes against the British, he faced one of the greatest ordeals of his career: capture and imprisonment aboard one of the most infamous vessels of the Revolutionary War. This experience would not only test his endurance but also reveal his genius for turning despair into defiance. In 1780, while commanding the sloop General Monk during operations in the Caribbean, Joshua engaged in a fierce fight with HMS Intrepid. Outnumbered and outgunned, his ship eventually fell to the British, and Barney was taken prisoner. For many naval officers, capture meant the end of their active service. Months or years languishing in a British prison, if not death from disease or neglect. For Joshua it meant a new battlefield. He was transferred to the notorious prison ship HMS Jersey, anchored in Wallabout Bay, off what is now Brooklyn. To Americans, this vessel was known simply as Hell Afloat. The name was no exaggeration. Prison ships were not designed for long-term confinement, yet the British crammed hundreds of American captives into their stinking, airless holds. Disease spread like wildfire in the foul, stagnant air. Rations were inadequate, often spoiled, and medical care was non-existent. Guards treated prisoners with brutality, beatings, and neglect. The mortality rate aboard such ships was staggering. Nearly half the men who entered never came out alive. The Jersey was intended to break men. Survivors emerged weak, broken, and often unwilling to rejoin the fight. The British calculated that by spreading fear of these floating tombs, they could discourage Americans from resisting. For most prisoners it worked, but not for Joshua Barney. Even in captivity he refused to surrender his will. Where others saw hopelessness, he saw opportunity. He began to study his captors with the same sharp, tactical mind he had once used to outmaneuver frigates at sea. He observed guard routines, catalogued their habits, and identified the weak points in ship security. Quietly, he took note of which fellow prisoners possessed the courage and discipline to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Most captives dreamed only of escape, slipping into the water and swimming for shore. Barney envisioned something bolder. He proposed seizing the Jersey itself and sailing her to safety. It was a plan so audacious it bordered on fantasy. The Jersey was heavily guarded, rotting, and barely seaworthy. She was anchored in the heart of British-controlled waters, surrounded by patrol ships ready to intercept any suspicious movement. By rational calculation, success was impossible. Yet Barney believed otherwise. He spent months preparing, slowly recruiting allies, refining strategies, and waiting for the right conditions of weather, guard rotation, and tide. Finally, in the fog of a November night in 1780, he and his co-conspirators struck. Moving with precision, they overwhelmed the guards, seized critical positions aboard the vessel, and, for the first time, tasted freedom within their grasp. But the challenge had only begun. The Jersey was in far worse shape than they imagined. Her hull leaked constantly, her rigging was failing, and her sails were nearly useless. Dawn exposed them to discovery, and British patrol ships quickly gave chase. Yet Joshua's knowledge of local waters gave him an edge. Using tides, currents, and every trick of seamanship he had learned since boyhood, he navigated through treacherous channels, slipping past fortifications and patrols. The escape electrified Americans. At a time when the revolution seemed to drag endlessly with no clear end in sight, news of Barney's defiance spread like wildfire. He had not merely escaped, he had humiliated the Royal Navy, stealing one of their own ships from under their noses. For patriots, it was proof that ingenuity and determination could defy even the most crushing circumstances. For the British, it was a reminder that their enemies were not as weak or broken as they believed. The ordeal of HMS Jersey revealed the deepest core of Joshua Barney's character. He could be beaten, captured, and thrown into the worst conditions imaginable, but he could not be broken. Where others saw only misery, he saw a chance to strike back. His escape was not just an act of survival, it was a declaration that even in the jaws of defeat, Americans could resist, adapt, and prevail. This experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. It hardened him, sharpened his resourcefulness, and gave him an unshakable conviction. No situation, however dire, was truly hopeless. There was always a way forward, always a new tactic, always a chance to turn despair into victory. That belief, born in the foul holds of the Jersey, would guide him through the wars to come. When the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, Joshua Barney, like many officers, found himself at a crossroads. The Continental Navy had been disbanded, funds were scarce, and America was still too young and fragile to sustain a large standing fleet. Many of Barney's fellow officers returned to civilian life, some becoming merchants, others fading into obscurity. But Barney was not content to retire to comfort or commerce. For him, the sea was not simply an occupation, it was his life's battlefield and his greatest teacher. Instead of stepping away, he sought new horizons. His reputation as a daring commander and resourceful tactician had spread far beyond American shores. When the French Navy offered him a commission, Barney accepted. For the next decade, he served under the tricolor flag, gaining experiences that would prove invaluable, not only to his own career but also to the United States when war returned. At the time, France was one of the premier naval powers in the world. Its fleets had centuries of experience, highly trained officers, and some of the most advanced ships afloat. For Barney, whose wartime service had been forged in the improvisational and often chaotic environment of the Continental Navy, this was a revelation. In France, he encountered professionalism on a scale America had never known. He participated in fleet operations across the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, where he observed disciplined coordination, precise maneuvers, and large-scale strategy that went far beyond the single-ship duels he had fought during the Revolution. This exposure transformed him. He learned to think not just as a captain of one vessel but as part of a greater system, a naval machine where logistics, intelligence, diplomacy, and economics were just as critical as cannon fire. The French taught him how to coordinate different types of vessels, how to integrate land and sea operations, and how naval warfare served broader political aims. He began to understand the ocean as more than a battlefield, it was a global chessboard where every move carried consequences for trade, alliances, and power. But Barney's service was not confined to observation. He fought in real engagements, commanding men and ships in high-stakes conflicts that tested his leadership. He navigated Mediterranean waters crowded with corsairs, witnessed the growing turbulence of French politics, and carried American boldness into the disciplined frameworks of European naval tradition. His reputation as a fearless but unconventional officer only deepened, earning respect from allies and enemies alike. Most importantly, his time with the French cemented his role as a bridge between two worlds. He remained loyal to the United States, but he absorbed lessons from Europe that his homeland desperately needed. America was still a naval infant compared to Britain, France, or Spain, but Barney returned with the knowledge of how great powers thought, fought, and planned. He understood that America could never simply imitate European navies ship for ship. It lacked the resources. Instead, it would have to innovate, adapting strategies to its unique geography, strengths, and limitations. This global education gave him a strategic vision far broader than most American officers of his era. He knew how European powers perceived naval warfare, and he understood where America could carve out advantages by refusing to play by their rules. The seeds of his later innovations, most famously the Chesapeake Bay Flotilla, were planted during these years of international service. When Barney returned to the United States in the early 1800s, the nation faced growing challenges at sea. European wars disrupted trade, and Britain's practice of impressing American sailors created outrage. Conflict loomed once again. But unlike many of his countrymen, Joshua Barney was not intimidated. He had seen the might of European navies up close. He had fought beside them, learned from them, and even outwitted them. He was uniquely prepared to face the storm that would become the War of 1812. Barney's decade in the French Navy was more than a career detour. It was an education in global strategy. It equipped him with knowledge no American naval officer of his generation possessed. When the call came again for service under the Stars and Stripes, he was ready, not just as a daring captain but as a visionary strategist who could redefine how a small, outmatched nation fought the greatest naval power on earth. When the War of 1812 erupted, America once again found itself staring down the full force of the British Empire. By this time, Joshua Barney was a seasoned veteran, having fought in the Revolution, endured imprisonment, and gained international experience with the French Navy. He understood better than most the immense imbalance of power. Britain commanded the world's most formidable fleet, while the United States had fewer than 20 proper warships scattered across vast ocean patrols. Matching the Royal Navy ship for ship was impossible. But where others saw hopeless odds, Barney saw an opportunity for innovation. His solution was radical for its time: the creation of the Chesapeake Bay Flotilla. Instead of trying to meet the British in deep waters, he proposed an entirely new kind of naval force designed specifically for the environment of the Chesapeake. This was no ordinary fleet. It was composed of shallow-draft gunboats, armed barges, and converted merchant vessels. Small, lightly armed, and seemingly unimpressive compared to the towering British ships of the line. But that was precisely the point. These vessels could go where British ships could not. The Chesapeake Bay was a labyrinth of inlets, rivers, and shallow channels. 4 large British warships. These waters were treacherous, restricting their maneuverability and exposing them to ambush. Barney's flotilla, on the other hand, could slip into creeks invisible from the main bay, emerge suddenly to attack supply lines or patrol ships, and vanish back into waterways too shallow for pursuit. It was, in effect, guerrilla warfare at sea. Between 1813 and early 1814, Barney's flotilla proved its worth. Time and again, his small force harassed the British, striking quickly and retreating before overwhelming firepower could be brought to bear. They disrupted supply lines, threatened British patrols, and sowed frustration among commanders accustomed to clear, decisive fleet battles. The flotilla could not hope to destroy the Royal Navy, but it denied the British easy control of the Chesapeake and forced them to commit far more resources than they expected to contain such a modest force. The psychological effect was as important as the military results. For Americans, the flotilla became a symbol of resilience. Ordinary citizens, demoralized by British raids and the destruction of property along the coast, found hope in stories of Barney's men striking back with daring and ingenuity. For the British, the flotilla was a constant irritation, a reminder that American resistance could not be swept aside as easily as they had assumed. What made the flotilla truly remarkable, however, was Barney's integration of naval and land operations. He understood that his small vessels could not operate in isolation. They worked closely with local militia, transporting troops and supplies, providing fire support during land battles, and gathering intelligence on British movements. This coordination created a defensive network greater than the sum of its parts. Soldiers could call on naval gunfire. Sailors could use army bases for repair and resupply. It was an early model of joint operations, a concept that would later become central to American military doctrine. The British, frustrated by this elusive enemy, eventually decided that the flotilla had to be eliminated once and for all. In 1814 they planned a massive amphibious campaign: destroy Barney's force, capture Washington, and deal the United States a psychological blow so severe it might force surrender. For Joshua Barney, this meant facing an impossible choice. He could retreat deeper into the bay, keeping his flotilla intact but abandoning the defense of the capital. Or he could scuttle his ships and march his sailors inland to fight his infantry, dragging their heavy cannons with them. True to his character, Barney chose the unconventional path. He abandoned his boats, transformed his sailors into soldiers, and prepared to defend Washington on land. It was a decision without precedent. A naval commander turning his fleet into an artillery brigade, but it was consistent with everything his career had represented. He refused to be confined by tradition. When the sea was denied to him, he made the land his battlefield. This decision set the stage for one of the most dramatic moments of his career: the Battle of Bladensburg, where his men would stand at the very heart of America's defense. On August 24, 1814, the fate of the young United States hung in the balance. British forces, hardened from years of fighting Napoleon's armies in Europe, were marching toward Washington, D.C. The American defenders, a patchwork of militia and hastily assembled troops, were poorly prepared for the challenge. Morale was shaky, discipline fragile, and most commanders expected a swift collapse. In the chaos of retreat and confusion, one man and his sailors stood ready to make a stand: Commodore Joshua Barney. Barney's Chesapeake Bay Flotilla had been destroyed to prevent its capture, but he refused to fade into irrelevance. Instead, he reformed his men into a land unit, sailors transformed into soldiers. Hauling heavy naval cannons overland, he organized them into artillery batteries, adapting his naval expertise for land combat. It was an unprecedented move in American military history, a naval commander leading sailors to fight as infantry on a battlefield. Yet Barney believed that even stripped of their ships, his men could make a difference. When the Battle of Bladensburg began, the British advanced with confidence. Their plan was straightforward. American militia would break and run, regulars would be exposed, and Washington would fall with little resistance. At first, events unfolded exactly as they expected. On the left flank, militia units collapsed almost immediately, fleeing before the disciplined British regulars. Panic spread, exposing American lines and forcing even regular army units into retreat. Within an hour, much of the American defense was in full flight. The road to Washington seemed wide open. But in the center of the battlefield stood Barney and his sailors. Positioned on a rise, their cannons loaded with grapeshot and canister rounds, they faced the advancing British with grim determination. These were not raw recruits. They were hardened seamen, disciplined by years of naval service, used to working under pressure and accustomed to fighting for survival. The British sent the 85th Light Infantry Regiment against them, veterans of campaigns against Napoleon's finest troops. These men had faced the French Imperial Guard and expected little trouble from Americans. Instead, they were met with a storm of fire. Barney's gunners, trained in the precision of naval combat, fired devastating volleys that tore holes through British formations. His sailors, armed with muskets, added deadly accurate volleys of their own. When the British tried to flank the position, they found themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire that Barney had carefully arranged, just as he would have positioned broadsides at sea. For over an hour, his small force held firm. Charge after charge was thrown back. British officers, stunned, watched as their veterans faltered against a handful of sailors fighting on foreign ground. American troops, retreating elsewhere, saw in Barney's stand a flicker of hope, that their forces could, under proper leadership, resist even the best of the British army. But courage and ingenuity could not change the math forever. Barney's men were outnumbered, their ammunition dwindling, and their guns battered by return fire. Then tragedy struck. A musket ball shattered Barney's thigh. Even as he fell, bleeding and in agony, he refused to abandon his post. From the ground, he continued giving orders, directing fire, and encouraging his men to fight on. Only when the British finally overran the position, literally climbing over his cannons, did he order a retreat. His sailors had held their ground for nearly 2 hours, far longer than anyone had believed possible. Their stand did not prevent the fall of Washington. The British would go on to burn the city, but it transformed the meaning of the battle. Instead of a complete rout, there was a story of defiance, of Americans standing their ground against the finest troops in the world. Even the enemy recognized the significance. General Robert Ross, the British commander, personally visited the wounded Barney, praising his courage and tactical brilliance. It was an extraordinary gesture, rarely extended to an enemy officer, and it showed the respect Barney had earned even in defeat. The Battle of Bladensburg was a disaster for American arms, but Barney's stand became a symbol. It proved that under determined leadership, Americans could resist, innovate, and fight with honor against overwhelming odds. For the young republic, this mattered as much as victory. Joshua Barney, wounded and captured, had given his nation a story of resilience in its darkest hour. When Joshua Barney finally fell wounded at Bladensburg, his thigh shattered by a musket ball, he had every reason to expect the worst. In wars of that era, captured officers often faced humiliation, neglect, or brutal imprisonment. Yet what happened next revealed both the depth of Barney's courage and the profound respect he had earned, even from his enemies. After the battle, British troops overran his position. His men, exhausted and running low on ammunition, were forced to retreat, leaving their commander bleeding beside his cannons. Barney, however, did not beg for mercy or express regret. Even in defeat, he carried himself with the calm dignity of a man who had done everything possible for his country. His bravery had not gone unnoticed. General Robert Ross, the British commander, personally visited Barney to commend his courage and skill. Ross, who had fought against some of Europe's finest generals, described Barney's defense as among the most determined he had ever seen. This was no small honor. Rarely did British officers extend such admiration to American foes, whom they often dismissed as amateurs or rabble. But in Barney they saw something different: a professional, a leader, and a man who fought not for glory but for principle. The respect he received as a prisoner was unlike that given to most captives. Instead of being thrown into harsh confinement, he was treated with a measure of dignity, his recovery prioritized, and his eventual exchange facilitated. For Americans, Barney's capture marked the end of his active combat career. His wound was severe and he never fully recovered. Yet his influence did not end with the battle. The men who had fought under him carried forward the lessons he had drilled into them: discipline under pressure, creative tactics, and the refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed inevitable. In many ways, his example became a living legacy, shaping the culture of the U.S. Navy and militia long after he left the battlefield. Barney also carried his perspective into politics. As a congressman representing Maryland, he brought rare insight into military debates. Unlike most of his colleagues, he had lived through the realities of combat at sea and on land. He understood the weaknesses of America's naval forces but also their unique potential. He argued that the United States should not try to imitate the massive fleets of Europe, an impossible task for a young nation, but instead focus on speed, flexibility, and innovation. His advocacy for small, specialized forces and for cooperation between land and sea operations anticipated doctrines that would define American strategy in later conflicts. Even as his health declined, Barney remained a symbol of what courage and ingenuity could accomplish. To the public, his story was one of determination against impossible odds. To military leaders, his tactics demonstrated that creativity could balance numerical weakness. To his fellow veterans, his resilience embodied the stubborn will of the revolutionary generation, men who refused to surrender their ideals no matter the cost. The British had captured his body, but they could not capture his spirit. His stand at Bladensburg, his respect from enemies, and his continuing influence on naval thought ensured that Joshua Barney's name would endure far beyond the War of 1812. Though he would die only a few years later in 1818, his leadership lived on in every American officer who understood that victory did not always come from overwhelming strength. Sometimes it came from refusing to bow, from fighting creatively, and from inspiring others to do the same. In this sense, Barney's capture was not the end of his story but the beginning of his legend. His defiance, recognized even by Britain's finest generals, became part of America's growing military tradition. A reminder that respect is earned not just in victory but also in the way one stands firm in defeat. By the time the War of 1812 ended, Joshua Barney's active fighting days were over. His wound from the Battle of Bladensburg left him permanently weakened, and though he was exchanged and returned home, his body never fully recovered. Yet in many ways his influence had only just begun. Barney's career was more than a sequence of battles. It was a blueprint for how Americans could face overwhelming odds with courage, adaptability, and ingenuity. After the war, he entered a new chapter of service, this time in politics. As a congressman from Maryland, Barney brought the perspective of a man who had lived and bled for his country. He understood what it meant to face the Royal Navy at sea, to endure the horrors of a prison ship, and to defend the nation's capital with improvised forces. Unlike many of his peers in Congress, his arguments were rooted not in theory but in hard-won experience. He urged the United States to resist the temptation of building a massive navy in the image of Britain or France. America could never match the great empire ship for ship, he argued, but it could succeed by embracing innovation: small, fast vessels, flexible tactics, and close cooperation between land and sea forces. These ideas, once radical, would prove prophetic. The principles Barney championed, joint operations, asymmetrical tactics, and creative use of geography, would echo through American military history. From Civil War river campaigns to modern Special Forces operations, the DNA of Barney's thinking runs deep. He had shown that America's strength lay not in imitating Europe but in forging its own path. Barney's life ended in 1818, when he died in Pittsburgh at the age of 59. His death closed the story of a man who had served his country from the Revolution through its Second War for Independence, a man who had seen America rise from vulnerable colonies to a nation that could stand on equal footing with the world's greatest empires. Though he did not live to see the full flowering of the United States as a global power, his contributions helped lay the foundations for that growth. What makes Joshua Barney's legacy so powerful is not just his record of service but the spirit he embodied. He demonstrated that leadership is not about rank or resources but about determination, adaptability, and courage. At Bladensburg, when militias fled and hope seemed lost, Barney's sailors stood firm. At sea, when outgunned and outnumbered, he refused to follow predictable rules, outthinking enemies who thought themselves invincible. In captivity, when broken conditions drove men to despair, he plotted escape and turned humiliation into triumph. Barney's story is also a reminder of the broader American character in its early years. The United States did not survive its infancy through sheer strength. It survived because of individuals who refused to quit. People like Joshua Barney proved that innovation could substitute for numbers, that creativity could counter tradition, and that belief in a cause could give ordinary men the strength to achieve the extraordinary. Today, his name is not as well known as John Paul Jones or Oliver Hazard Perry, but his example remains just as relevant. Every time an American military unit adapts to an unfamiliar battlefield, every time leaders inspire their troops by sharing risk and hardship, and every time a nation refuses to accept defeat despite impossible odds, Joshua Barney's spirit is present. His life tells us that greatness is not about starting with every advantage. It is about refusing to surrender no matter the challenge. Barney proved that one determined individual, armed with courage and imagination, can alter the course of history. He may have died in 1818, but his legacy continues to live. In the Navy he helped shape, in the doctrines he inspired, and in the American belief that the word, impossible, is never the final answer.